Second verse hell, something that probably every songwriter who's written more than, I don't know, one song has gone through before. Let's talk about it. So in almost everything in life, the middle is the hardest. This is a common theme, whether it be with songwriters, or whether it be with authors, or whether it be with writing a paper, or really any other project. Very often the middle is the hardest, because at the beginning, the ideas are flowing, you're passionate, and then at the end, you have the light at the end of the tunnel to help inspire you through to the end. But in the middle, that's where we can often get lost. This is often the part of books that authors say are the hardest to write. The middle is just very often, whether from story structure standpoint or just from project standpoint, the middle's the hardest. So the good news here, I guess, is that we really should just go into a song expecting that one of the hardest lyrics to write is going to be our second verse. And another reason the second verse tends to be difficult is that constraints tend to add difficulty. If you think about it, when it comes to songwriting, when you write a chorus, you usually need to match one melody with one set of lyrics, unless you have choruses that change lyrics. And then when it comes to a bridge, you have one melody that needs to match with one set of lyrics. Then when it comes to verses, very often you have at least two sets of lyrics that need to match with just one melody. So if you already wrote your first verse, you already have the melody. So you already have the meter that you need to follow for the second verse. And you need to have that second verse lyric actually match with that same melody. So now you have all these constraints that you just didn't have for any of the other song sections, because you could always just adjust the melody, change the lyrics a little bit. All you had to do was have one chorus lyric with one melody. But with verses, you need to have two, maybe even three different sets of lyrics that all match with the same melody. Not to mention that you might have other things like rhyme scheme that you feel the need to match that, again, has already been set. If you have an A-B rhyme scheme in your first verse, you probably should at least try to match that, at least with an XA, if not an A-B again. But the good news is the biggest problem of all when it comes to second verse hell is actually the one that I think is most preventable, which is basically going into the second verse not knowing what we are going to talk about. Totally preventable because every song section should have a job. Very often we get stuck in second verse hell, not necessarily just for the other reasons, but mostly because we wrote the first verse already and the chorus already. We might have even written the bridge. And now we're like, what else is there left to say? Which is totally preventable. All we need to do is come up with an outline or a song map before we write our lyrics so that each song section has a job. Then we know the first verse is covering this part of the story and the second verse needs to cover this part of the story. That gives us an arc to our song before we actually write it, and it gives each section a job so we don't get stuck in the really awkward position of, crap, I kind of covered everything already with a first verse I really like and a chorus I really like and a bridge I really like. So then you either need to repeat what you said in the first verse but in a different way, which usually is a recipe for disaster, or just a really forgettable second verse, or you need to totally rewrite your first verse even though you liked it because frankly it covered too much. You needed to leave something for the second verse. Regardless of how you address it from that point, it's avoidable. We can just avoid that to begin with by simply outlining or mapping out our song so that we know before we write any of our verses exactly what each verse has to say. And connected to this, if there's a rule that maybe you should take away, it's that our song structure should ultimately be downstream of our outline. If you figure out that I want to have the chorus address the main theme, and then the story is going to be told in the verses and possibly the bridge. And you figure out there's three parts to this story. That should dictate whether there are three verses or two verses and a bridge or just two verses. Because if you have three parts of the story, that means you probably want to either have three verses or two verses and a bridge. And depending on what each part of the story is, that might help you decide whether it should be three verses or two verses and a bridge. If the third part of the story is a clear climax, you would want that to be the bridge instead of just a third verse. If it's not really the climax, it's just another story point that's not really any different than the first two story points, maybe you just want three verses. But regardless, if you only have, say, two things to say with the story, then you can't have two verses and a bridge because you only have two different things to say. So figure out the outline first and then have your song structure match with that. Make sure it's downstream of the outline you've figured out. And while we're talking about song sections, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my song sections cheat sheet. I know a lot of times people throw around words like chorus and pre-chorus and post-chorus and bridge, and people are like, honestly, I don't really know what that means. Like, what really is a pre-chorus? What really is a post-chorus? If you want to listen to some examples of songs with timestamps that are like, okay, this is where the pre-chorus starts, this is where the post-chorus starts, and a breakdown of the general rules or themes or the tendencies of each song section, be sure to check this out. My free gift to you. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.